Hello, my name is Danielle Verwers, and today we'll be talking about media, technology, and the growing brain. So you don't have to be a neuroscientist to understand that brains are different. As children grow up, their brain changes. A baby's brain is different from a child's brain. A child's brain is different from the adolescent brain, and the adolescent brain is different from an adult brain. Understanding these differences and what is happening inside of the brain in terms of processing can help us really lead and guide students and children through the world of technology and media. Young children are moving from the perceptual to conceptual, from centration to decentration. They experience what we call a perceptual boundedness, which is an over-reliance on how things appear, how they sound, and this comes at the expense of subtle hints or the non-obvious. For example, a young child might decide that all ugly characters are cruel and that a beautiful, gorgeous character is always nice. As children grow, they begin to move on from this stage and realize that physical appearance isn't the only thing they need to judge behavior on. They start looking at a character's motivation and their actions to decide whether or not they're mean or nice. Younger children also tend to focus on a really obvious feature of characters. For instance, a red nose on a clown. And they'll focus in on this feature, again, at the expense of other characteristics. As children grow older, they move beyond their senses and begin moving from the concrete to inferential thinking. And they do this by beginning to judge the reality of what they see in media. Older children begin to take perceptual clues, production clues, purpose, and genre into consideration when they're engaging with media. For instance, if they are watching a movie and they know that it is a comedy, when a character gets hurt, they'll know that the character is fine and that the intent or the purpose of the genre is to make the viewer laugh. Finally, adolescents begin to move from the real to plausible in their thinking, from empirical to hypothetical, and from cognition to metacognition. In other words, when an older teen watches a Disney Channel show designed for preteens, they're going to recognize that while the characters on the show are real, the scenarios that they often find themselves in are not plausible. All children, whether they're young children or adolescents, will need cognitive ability to process media. So first they'll have to be able to process or find the important information. They'll be using their visual signals, auditory signals, and learn how to focus their attention on what's most important. In this process, they're learning to determine what's essential and non-essential. Next, they have to sequence the input that they're receiving. They'll take the actions and the major events and put them into some sort of story. And from that story, they'll infer. They'll draw inferences from both the explicit and implicit cues. Now, for younger children, they're going to be heavily relying on those explicit clues because remember, they're not thinking conceptually. They're centering in on physical cues. Finally, they'll have to make sense or create meaning from those implications. And this meaning is very dependent upon background, the knowledge that a child brings when they watch media, engage with media. For instance, a child who grows up in a rural area may be able to create more meaning from a video about farms as opposed to a child who's lived in the city their whole life. And then finally, they're going to evaluate the media. Essentially, do I like it or do I not like it? Keep in mind that not all children have the cognitive ability to work through this process of making sense of the media that they're being exposed to. So we have to keep in mind that there are some real problems with media. There's an exposure to sex, drugs, violence, even dangerous people. There can be cyberbullying happening in media, which increases the risk for depression and even suicide. Oversharing is a real problem when children don't have maturity, and that can lead to a violation of privacy. Exposure to media can also lead to problems with health, including sleep problems, not enough exercise, and these health problems can lead to mental health problems where students are unable to complete their homework, engage in healthy relationships with others. Media can have positive effects as well. It provides children and adolescents with a sense of connection. They can find like-minded friends who share similar interests. It's also an excellent opportunity for artists to collaborate on projects. Technology and media provide opportunities for exploration and expression. There's a lot we really don't know about all of this technology and media and the long-term effects that it will have on children. We know that adverse childhood experiences can have negative consequences for children. What we don't quite understand at this point is whether or not the media experiences that children have through their phones, TV shows, and other platforms are creating those same adverse experiences in the brain. But we know that adverse childhood experiences create trauma, and trauma can lead to problems for children later on in life. It's important to understand trauma because traumatic events rewire the brain. Trauma is more than simple stress. Trauma is an emotional experience that's overwhelming, prolonged. It's unexpected, alarming. It can feel random, unpredictable, but most importantly, it's raw. It's unprocessed, confusing, and misunderstood. Trauma can be a result of abuse, physical, mental, or sexual. It can also be the result of neglect, that's physical or emotional, or even household dysfunction, such as mental illness, domestic violence, substance abuse, divorce, or an incarcerated relative. There's chronic trauma, acute trauma, historical and racial trauma, and complex trauma. As parents and caregivers and professionals, we don't necessarily have to categorize the trauma that kids have been through. We just have to create environments that are safe and supportive for all students, and that includes the technological environment they're engaging in. So, how do we make sure that children and adolescents are not experiencing trauma when they are using technology? There are two perspectives about kids in the media. One is a paternalistic approach that says children are naive, they're vulnerable, and they must have adult protection. The second perspective is that children are savvy and they really need our empowerment, and they need to negotiate their own learning online. Now, whether you fall in one camp or the other, or somewhere in between, we do know that students will need cognitive scaffolding to process what they encounter in media. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, when children see political violence, much like we've seen on television in the last year, they need a trusted adult to help them separate the facts of the event from the opinions that might be shared about the event. They need to have any misunderstandings clarified. They need to talk about the emotional effect that image or experience had on them, and adults are uniquely qualified to help students process that media. So in conclusion, we've talked about the neurological processes in the brain in relation to media. We've talked about trauma, how abuse, neglect, and dysfunction can make it difficult for children to engage in meaningful relationships. And we've also talked about how we as adults, caregivers, and professionals have a role to play. Technology and media, they're always changing. So as parents and caregivers, we're constantly traveling an uncharted path, a path full of wondrous adventures and rocks and tripping stones. As we acknowledge the pros and cons of media, the effect of abuse, neglect, and dysfunction on the brain, it's important that we do our part to ensure the best outcomes for students.